My name is Randall Kuhn. I'm a demographer, but I'm a demographer in a School of International Affairs at the University of Denver. So very interested not just in population change and health and longevity, but at the broader societal implications of that. I just want to say how appreciative I am to Aubrey and the Sense Foundation, again, for funding our work, but also for really, I think, having the bravery to confront the issues that you face on the policy side, not just by having an advocacy team, though they seem wonderful as well, but by actually confronting the science of what the resistance is. Sci-fi really, the scenarios that I'm going to be talking about, because we can only go so far with the literature on what the consequences of longevity would be for the future when you get into this scenarios that I'll be showing you. So sci-fi and movies of immortality have definitely been a benefit for us. We have a big sci-fi geek, Eli Margolese Malin, thanks to him. He keeps up with all the sci-fi. He's actually going to put together an immortality film festival back at the school this year, so we have lots of good recommendations. And of course, Aubrey needs to fund you to study Elysium now, since that was the big immortality film of the summer. Okay, so we got this? So I'm going to talk first about the international futures model that we're using to do these forecasts of the long-term consequences of negligible senescence. And I wish that Barry Hughes, who developed this model, could have also come here and we could have tag teamed, because he's so great at giving life to what the model is, because he's given life to this model for 30 years. And again, the world is a very complex place. So our model is complicated, but it's probably not even as complicated as some of your models of the human body. And we've got 7 billion human bodies in 190 or so countries that we're having to forecast, and their political systems. So obviously, not everything is going to be explained by this body, but by this model. And it's really not here to predict the future, so much as the International Futures System is a comprehensive. Should I be in the mic, by the way? I'm loud, but I may not be that loud.
You're fine.
I'm good. I'm good. Okay. A comprehensive quantitative tool for modeling, analyzing, and visualizing long-term scenarios, right? So there are no probability ranges. There's no kind of Nostradamus. We're here to imagine, what if we manipulated these variables? And so that's the name, thus the acronym IFS for International Futures, is about thinking about alternatives. It's hosted at the Pardee Center for International Futures at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. As I said, it's been developed by Barry Hughes back in the Fortran days 30 years ago. Now it's, I think, in Visual Basic. It's currently incorporated into the UN Human Development Report, the US National Intelligence Estimate, various EU planning documents, and most of them are focused more on political and economic outcomes. But this series of books on patterns of potential human progress, I had the pleasure of being part of the third volume in that series, which was on improving global health. We basically took the global burden of disease study, detailed age, sex, cause, mortality, and morbidity data, and forecast into the future changes in those and what their consequences would be for development and progress going into the future. Here's an overview of the IFS model, right? Everything is connected. There's a lot of different domains. I like this depiction perhaps even better. They just came out with this. This is the network node diagram. You'll notice, if I can figure out the laser, that population is the biggest one in here. So Malthus was right, I guess. It's all population, except it turns out to be intermediated by all these thousands of other variables. The IFS is a great tool for just if you want to look at national indicators, or if you want to do some forecasting. I'll show that at the end again. Okay, so from our end, we're not biologists. As demographers do think about longevity issues, but I just want to go into a little bit of the motivation for us on why we would be interested in doing a forecast, especially for a forecast that's mostly focused on human development issues, very kind of long-term but predictable policy-oriented issues. Why would we want to do a forecast of negligible senescence? And one interesting one that I've found fascinating to watch unfold is that there's no better stress test that you can construct for a model, like for the robustness of a model with population at the center, than to actually cause human longevity to explode. So it's been interesting to see where the model hasn't collapsed yet with any of the changes we've run, but it's certainly produced some difficult to reconcile outcomes, as I'll get to in a couple of minutes. Next, in my opinion, and I think it's increasingly being accepted, is that current longevity forecasts, and I think Alex conveyed this pretty well, current longevity forecasts, whether for political reasons or because people aren't seeing the full picture, do not consider a range of plausible high upside longevity scenarios. And I don't want to say whether I think the particular scenarios we'll be presenting are plausible, but certainly if the Social Security Administration is saying we'll live to 95 in the year 2100 on average, that seems like they're kind of shooting a little bit low. So it's important to sort of look at these things, higher longevity scenarios, and of course to look at them more than just what they'll do with population, but also look at broader indicators like human well-being, economic growth, and the environment. Past demographic models illustrate that mortality is not the key driver of population growth. And so this is going to be one of the things that we'll be looking at. So Ansley Cole, the godfather of all demographers, in 1959 published a paper where he actually did a simulation of what would the consequences be for immortality. And he found that a shift to immortality of the human population would actually add less to the long-term population of the Earth than just if the baby boom in the West had continued. Those elevated fertility levels that we saw from 1946 to the time he was writing the paper, if those had just continued forever, that's how much more powerful fertility is as a driver of population growth than mortality. But Ansley Cole was constructing a scenario that focused on immortality without any change in fecundity. And so I was fascinated to hear about this association between immortality and a loss of fertility, because if anything is different about the models that we're going to be looking at here in a second and other models, again, the ages that people are living to are certainly much higher. But the big difference is that we're looking at not just an extension of post-reproductive life, I presume, this is what we've discussed this with Aubrey, but a rising fecundity, an extension of the reproductive life that could lead to a baby boom like no other. So we might actually be seeing a scenario, not that we will, but we could, in theory, see a scenario where people are living forever and they are able to reproduce forever. And whether due to accidents or intentions, they may produce a lot more kids. And so again, fertility is going to end up being really important. So what I just want to show is, what we want to separate out to some extent in this model is that negligible senescence will lead to a drop in mortality, to a rise in fecundity that will yield basic, immediate mechanical changes in the human population age distribution that will have consequences for economic and social change, environmental change, and so on. And we have the ability to adapt, right? That then there can be a behavioral response to fertility, in fertility and in the economy, that can have, that any imbalances that emerge, we can put back into balance through technology, through policy, whatever it might be, and that this analysis hopefully will be a starting point for framing those alternatives. I will leave that for a while. Okay, model it. So just key goals of this current study. The first big thing is just to extend our age pyramids from 0 to 100 up to 0 to 200. So we're not doing immortality, but we're also, we're going to create a scenario where everyone lives to 200 and then we don't see what happens to them in the system after 200, since there are no 200-year-olds on Earth yet by the time our simulation ends. So for all we know, they might be immortal. We want to build scenarios around the rollout of the technologies promoting delayed or negligible senescence. I'm going to talk a little bit about both, including mortality, morbidity, and fertility effects. We want to model the range of impacts on demographic change, human systems, and natural systems. And we want to begin to visualize what the adaptations that might be needed are. Okay, how am I on time?
10 more minutes.
Okay, good. So the mortality modeling. Alex has actually previewed a lot of this for me, which is great. And I think everyone here is probably pretty good at math and mortality distributions and things like that. So basically, we're not using a Gompertz distribution to forecast mortality. We're using something just a little more straightforward, which is a shifting logistic distribution that we're applying separately. So first of all, I should say, we have these WHO cause, age, sex-specific estimates for each country. Essentially, what we do is flip a switch and replace them with something more simple that we can apply to communicable, non-communicable, and accidents and injuries, the three big causes of death in the ICD. We can apply them separately for men and women in each country, and that basically we've got this logistic expression that has one term for level and one term for the age shape of mortality. And I'm going to show some graphs here in a second. So, right, the shape, the beta, is the senescence term. For now, we assume, we're having a hard time thinking realistically about these assumptions around diffusion, of how quickly would people get this intervention in developing countries or within countries. And frankly, given that the rest of my day is focused on global health in countries where people can't even get antibiotics that we throw into our water stream, it's a little bit hard to even contemplate, but we need to eventually. For right now, we assume that every country, in this illustrative model, that every country achieves total rollout. Even, Democratic Republic of Congo, whatever countries you're talking about, we assume global diffusion for now. We also make fairly simplistic assumptions about morbidity, basically proportionality to mortality. So in the negligible senescence model, if mortality is going to zero, then morbidity is also going to zero, which I think fits very much with the vision that most people around here have of negligible senescence. And in delayed senescence, there would be an accumulation of morbidity just as there's an accumulation of mortality. So here are the J-curves of mortality. This is on a log scale. So this is our base case, what we forecast, and you can't, the blue is unfortunately under the, is it? No, sorry, yeah, it's under the red, right, they're all, what we're seeing here is we don't introduce any changes for people under 25. We're basically only addressing the senescent component of mortality. Here's the base case, right, where, again, things are a little bit better, gradually better over time. This is the base case for 2030. So that this is roughly what the curve would look like in the base case now. Then we have this delayed senescence case, right, where we've essentially taken the curve for 25 plus and shifted it to the right, right? We haven't changed the fundamental shape of senescence. We've just pushed everything back 20 years, so it piles up later on. And then we have the negligible senescence. And again, on a log scale, this means that even though this is sloping upwards, right, this is 1 in 1,000 deaths among 125 to 129-year-olds. So these are our three basic mortality scenarios. And I hesitate to even call this life expectancy, right? Since we don't go past 200. In fact, in the negligible senescence scenario, we have no idea what the life expectancy is. We just know that a majority of people won't be dying by 200. So essentially, this is the life expectancy up to 200. But in fact, it would be a lot higher. But the point is mortality, right? That I saw, I think some of Alex's scenarios were looking at an 80% reduction in mortality. The negligible senescence scenario is basically a 99% reduction in mortality, and of course, a shift in the senescence pattern. Okay, I think this is the best illustration of what our scenarios do. This is the crude death rate, which is just at a population, deaths divided by total number of people. And what it captures is the force of mortality at any given age convoluted with the age distribution. Right? So right now in the world, according to our forecast, we're about bottoming out in crude death rate because people are getting older and older, right? Countries like the US, Japan, Sweden are already well into our upslope, into rising crude death rates because even though mortality is declining at every age, we're becoming so old, right? So slowly but gradually, crude death rates will rise a little bit, level off in the base case. In the delayed senescence scenario, you get this great pattern that really illustrates what we're talking about, right? Death rates plunge. We've pushed the death curve back 20 years. So essentially, for 20 years, nobody dies, and then they go back to being as they were. And so even though life expectancy has gone from 80 to 120, all we've really done is delay the inevitable, right? The competing risks. The force of mortality catches up with you. And then in the negligible senescence scenario, that's not what's happening clearly, right? We're keeping crude death rates low. Essentially, nobody's dying. Okay, and so I'm going to get to the results of all that after I describe the fertility scenarios. We have a very clear basis for how we might forecast the distribution of mortality. When it comes to fertility, especially because fertility is so much a combination of biology and behavior, and because nobody's really thought about this maintained or even restored fecundity question, we really had to keep a very, very flexible model where we just, and it's not, right now it's not endogenized to the change in mortality. It's something we apply exogenously based on a number of variables: the starting age, the peak level of fertility, the time it takes to get to half that level, and the age at which people stop. And we build 3 scenarios that I'm only going to tack on to the negligible senescence scenario. So I'm going to say we have a base fertility scenario where essentially we forecast, because that's sort of socially acceptable to say total fertility rate will reach 2.0 at some point in the future. That's what we end up having as our base. Then we have a fertility spike phased in to 2030, a baby boom, right? Where over time, total fertility rate rises from 2 to a higher level. And then we have a rebalance, where at 2030, after this spike happens, rather than the spike continuing, we go back down. There's a correction. These are the age-specific fertility curves. This is the base one, right? The moderate, and again, there is one that's even higher, where women just kind of keep having babies and keep having babies, but that would lead to like 1 trillion people in 2200, so we'll not talk about that. But this one, basically, you get a little bit of delay in childbearing, but what you really have then is this extension, a long tail of fertility into the 60s, 70s, 80s, pretty much done, right? We assume to some extent that, right, old habits will die hard, that a lot of people won't, a lot of 100-year-olds won't be wanting to have a baby. And again, I have a lot of questions about this. A lot of my female colleagues who I've talked to about this project are like, I can't wait for this to be over. So there's a lot of interesting social choice questions in there. And then the adapted scenario is one where the peak drops, and we get much more to like a flat life course, where people they have a peak. It's a later peak, though, but to some extent births are spread out over the lifetime. And again, if a total fertility rate that I'm going to talk about, right, is the number of children that you have that a woman has in her lifetime. So a total fertility rate of 2 is very different for a woman who's only fertile between 15 and 49 and a woman who's fertile between 15 and 200, right? That's the same 2 babies per woman, but the second set of 2 babies is spread out over 185 years. So it is much lower fertility. And so to some extent, I have this question of, if you had 2 kids, but you hadn't had a kid for 100 years, would you think of that as, in fact, an association between immortality? It's not that immortality led to infertility, it's that it led to more time with no babies around, so maybe you'll have with your 3rd husband in the last 1,000 years, you'll have even more kids, or whatever it might be, in our science fiction scenarios. So this is the world trend of total fertility rate, right, going down, 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 and then in the base case, it keeps going down. In the one scenario, it spikes up and stays high, and in the next one, it spikes up, we get a baby boom, and then it goes back down. Okay, and here's the crude birth rate, which I'll skip. So here's the population results, just to sort of, and again, take these numbers for what they are. They're based on stylized scenarios. In the base case, we now have world population in 2100 not maxing out, actually maxing out below 10 billion, so just a little short of 10 billion. In the delayed senescence scenario, right, all that really happens is you add a bunch of 90, 100, 110-year-olds to the population, and you get about 2.5 billion, 3 billion extra people. In the negligible senescence scenario, where you don't have any where fertility per lifetime stays about the same, again, take with this what you will. It's not as emphatic as Ansley Cole's results back in 1959, because fertility is much lower now. But it is certainly, I think a lot of people would say, immortality, the planet's going to be like teeming with people. And some people might think going from 10 billion to 16 billion is too many. I mean, again, there are a lot of people who, I won't get into overpopulation debates, drive me nuts. The point being, you could take the perspective that a 60-70% increase in population relative to the base is actually not all that big, considering we're on a planet where population is increased by a factor of 8 in the last couple hundred years.
2 minutes.
60% bump might not be too bad. Oh, are we? Okay. And then, of course, we have, but what really matters is the fertility, right? In this scenario where people keep having 3 children, 3.5 children per lifetime, we get, again, fertility keeps going up and up and up. The other thing that matters in these forecasts, of course, is age distribution. To the extent that fertility stays low, again, two births spread out over 200 years is going to lead to very slow birth rates, and so you're going to have a very old population. So this is the population distribution on the simulation with no fertility spike. In this simulation, the population peaks in the year 2170 at about 20 billion, but then it actually levels off. We're just at a different equilibrium with about twice as many people as we would have otherwise had. But what you get is an increasingly older and older and older population. The baby boom that I showed adds not that much to the population, right? You get this group of, right, you get it looks a lot like the historic baby boom phenomenon. You get a bump of extra people during the baby boom years, and then you get these echoes down the generations. You don't add that many people, and you don't have that much of an appreciable effect on the age distribution of the population, but you have this big group of people running through the population. And then here's the age structure of the scenario with the moderate fertility, the 3.5 children per woman. What you get is not, there's a trade-off here, right? You get a much, much bigger population, right? This was about 20 billion. You get a population that does not peak. It tops 100 billion around 2170 and keeps going up and up, but you get a nice young population, which some people might value. Okay, so that's sort of, if there's kind of an overarching set of results, I would say, right, it's that population is going to be bigger, perhaps not less big than you might think, but that what's really going to show up are some social choices between lots of population growth or way more population growth and a slightly less old population. Just to put some context on the retirement picture, this is the consumption needs of the age 65 and over population as a percent of GDP. Not surprisingly, those rise a lot, especially in scenarios where you don't have a bunch of extra kids being born. So in the scenario where population doesn't grow that much, you've got a population that is now majority over 65. The forecast that we've built, right, is highly endogenous. All kinds of things happen when you introduce changes. To some extent, we forecast huge increases in government pension transfers as a percent of GDP. Also, a big increase in precautionary savings because people save more when they live longer. And yet, still, the consumption needs of the over 65 population that are not met by the government still amount to about 30% of GDP in these scenarios. What that means, we started to imagine what would the retirement age have to get to? About 110 by the year 2100. And so you can sort of take what you will, whether people would appreciate that or not, but I'll just finally add, that's retiring at 110 and assuming actually a surprising amount, and this is, a lot of people will react in a strange way to this. This is gross domestic product per capita. We actually forecast, and we're not happy about this, our model forecasts, right, that in the scenarios with people living a really long time and having this rapidly growing population with 100 billion people, we actually forecast a higher GDP per capita, right? Because, and for good reasons, right? We've already heard in a number of sessions that longevity leads to higher productivity. The only problem is this. Our model also shows that in the higher fertility scenario, sorry, not this one, calories per capita are dropping. So we actually forecast the amount of food in the world. Calories per capita are actually barely maintaining the current level in these scenarios. And in the scenario with all the population growth, calories per capita cuts in half. Food prices go through the roof. Energy prices, price of a barrel of oil or the equivalent are $1,000. And so, just to wrap up, right, the real point, to some extent, we're just ending the second phase of this model, of this grant cycle with SENS, where we can actually make this model run. But the real point is, right, to some extent, we can start to see what some of the population impacts would be. We can start to imagine what some of the trade-offs would be. And so one thing that we really want to be able to do is to start looking at sustainability. Can we square this circle between a world where we run out of food and a world where we become more productive and we live forever? How could we start to imagine what the limits are and what the policies would need to be to reconcile that? Socially, obviously, we need plausible scenarios for global diffusion of the intervention based in large part on price and technology transfer. And finally, I still have this question, and we heard a lot about this in a number of different sessions, but certainly in the sci-fi films, what morbidities would persist in a post-senescent world due either to frailty or choice? Meaning, what is beyond senescence? Should we, and I actually would welcome comments. I know I used up a little more time than I wanted. Comments, even if it's after the session, on what, say, should we be looking at an accumulating burden of mental illness or some cause of morbidity that does not relate to mortality? Is it ennui? Is it boredom? What is it that, or will it, and not because we necessarily believe that that's what's going to happen, but because that's what the skeptics would worry about. So the IFS software is available at ifs.du.edu. The forecasts are also incorporated into Google Public Data Explorer. We'll be working with SENS over time to make a super long life version of this available to folks. And thank you all for your time.